we thought it was appropriate that we present something to Lee and Kevin. And Lee is going to speak, for those of you who have watches, for exactly 3 minutes. So, Easton Historical Society and Museum presented to Avery Lee Williams, Jr. in appreciation for funding Chowder and Chatter for 20 years, May 2019.
Yes. Okay, 3 minutes. When did my time start? When you made the presentation?
No.
All right, now. Okay. I gotta find all the way you any more, five, what you been saying, wait a minute. No, it's the wrong show. Wrong show, folks. Now, RBC Wealth Management. Who are they, for crying out loud? 3 letters. Let me tell you. Royal Bank Canada. We're a wholly owned subsidiary. Most of you are probably never going to do business with us. Why do we host this? Well, we're from Easton. We just like to chip in, that's all. But to open an account with us, you have to have at least $500,000 of investable funds. Might eliminate a few of you in the room, but most of you could do it if you wanted. I know that. In any case, my son Kevin, who's in Columbus, Ohio tonight, God only knows why. There's nothing in Columbus. And Nora Youssef, you may have heard of that young woman, is out on an appointment. Leaves it to me, last man standing. We have 3 generations. In a few weeks, if I last that long, I'll be 84 years old. They say that growing old is like being increasingly punished for a crime you have not committed. RBC is headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's where our back office is. This Midwesterners, very nice to work with. A lot of Scandinavians out there. You know how bad they are. No, they're good people, nice to work with. Okay. So we oversee over $400 million of investable funds. We have more money than we oversee than most of the banks around here. You don't know it. We're kind of quiet. We have Kevin and Nora and 2 licensed assistants there. And that doesn't represent all the wealth that our clients have, because some of them, like most of them, have 2 or 3 homes and some wonderful automobiles, and a lot of them own companies and things like that. So it's well over $1 billion that we oversee. So it's kind of a serious thing. We try to make it into as much fun as we can, but some of the best fun we have is when we host Chowder and Chatter. So thanks very much for being here this evening, and I want to give you one little war story. I did my genealogy. Now, some of you know I'm a member of the Mayflower Society, and along the way back, around 1734, one of my family, a carpenter or a farmer, no doubt, married a young woman named Ames. And then about 20 or 30 years later, another Ames woman made the same mistake again and married my family. But the one that made the biggest mistake between the Williams family, although this goes through my great-grandmother, Harriet Allen, the biggest mistake my family made was we chose to be carpenters and farmers. Now the Ameses decided to be blacksmiths. Now, you know, work with metal, things like that, and you big families then. No Social Security. Hope some of those kids are old, grow up enough so they can take care of you in your old age, you know. So you got 8 kids, 4 of them might be sons. They can't all shoe horses, you know. They got to find something else to do with that hot metal and make things out of it. One of them came up with the idea of digging implements like shovels. And so you can see my family chose the wrong occupation. But these guys are my cousins, as distant though it may be. They can't do anything about the DNA, they're stuck with it.
yes. Who had this original idea? Was someone who's not here with us tonight, but his special lady is, and the person who had the idea was Dr. Robert Meselitz. He came here, he talked to the staff, and they were interested in having us. So we would like to honor Carol Mesowitz with a similar kind of award. So Carol, if you don't mind coming forward, we have something for you to take home. Easton Historical Society and Museum presents to Dr. Robert and Carol Mesowitz in appreciation for creating Chowder and Chatter 20 years ago, May 2019.
Oh, thank you.
And Lisa,
Could I be the thorn between the roses?
Where's your award?
Oh, my goodness.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, good job.
Before Nancy has the raffle tickets pulled, we'd like to have the workers come out front, please, and just take a bow for what you did.
Ah, great job. You're hired.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to our 20th annual Chowder and Chatter. That's very, very impressive, and I'd like to, on behalf of our Historical Society, again, thank RBC and our friends, the Williams family, who are certainly go-getters and have done a lot for the town, including the Historical Society. So tonight we're actually going to be talking about the Historical Society, in particular the donation of the railroad station to the Society way back 50 years ago. And we're going to start off, Hazel is going to tell us the origin myth of why we have a railroad station instead of, I don't know, what else could we have? It seems impossible. The railroad station is so much a part of our town and our history. Let's start it off, Hazel.
It's November 7th, 1969. I happen to be president of the Historical Society, and 7 weeks before, I had given birth to our first son. So the board meeting is in our kitchen. I thought that was the wisest place, just in case the baby needed some care. There were 7 of us sitting around the kitchen table. The doorbell rings, and when I went, it was Abraham Brooks, the lawyer. How many of you remember Abraham Brooks living on Center Street? He was the lawyer for many of us, including the Ameses. He put a key in my hand, and he said, Hazel, this is the key to the railroad station, and the 3 Ames brothers and Mr. Parker have bought it for you. And he left before I could even say thank you. You can just imagine the shock that someone is giving us the railroad station. The 7 of us decided, obviously, we would go and see if it were really true. We had 2 flashlights in the house. Duncan Oliver had one. So 7 of us with 3 flashlights, and obviously Dave stayed home with the baby, went. Miracle 1. The key fit, and the door opened, and that was a total shock. When we went in, the second shock was, even though we knew it hadn't been used for 10 years, it looked like somebody left work that afternoon and left papers all over to take care of tomorrow. In other words, that there had been no kind of cleanup. Obviously, the station, New York, New Haven, Hartford, had gone bankrupt. And the Ameses bought it, and Mr. Parker, in a silent auction. You have to picture 7 people, 3 flashlights. The only thing I think we were disappointed, well, There were no utilities, but it was all painted a horrible green. New Haven green, and who were we to criticize? I just was overcome by the color. But that's the least. We decided to go upstairs. And if you know the stairs, they bend. So picture 7 people, 3 flashlights, going up those stairs. And when we got to the top, again, it looked like it had been just left as it was the day before. I tripped. I tripped over a mattress because in those days, the engineer, conductor, would stay overnight. In other words, that New York, New Haven, Hartford had a key to the building, obviously, and when they came in on the midnight train, they would sleep upstairs and then be obviously ready for the 5:30 or 6 train. The other thing with the mattress, I think some pigeons had found some holes in the roof. So as I'm tripping, I'm noticing it's not only a mattress, but there were a few souvenirs. But it was our station. I can't explain what it meant to us. We had been meeting in the library. Everybody was very good to us, but we have a home. We went back to the house. I made more coffee, told Dave, and the treasurer said, "Do you know how much money we have? $200. How do we fix the station?" By the way, almost every window was boarded. No utilities. And it's really a compliment to the town of Easton how many people, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, senior citizens, everybody came for a number of years to paint, to scrape. Well, we scraped and then we painted. Money was raised. Walter Hatch and Gus Winroth, if you remember the names, they actually took out all the windows that were boarded and put in new ones from old storm windows with no heat. And so within 2 or 3 years, the station really was functioning. And we really have to credit the 3 Ames brothers and Mr. Parker.
Was Ken?
And Ken Jackson, Ken Jackson, tremendous influence. We were very fortunate to have Ken for so long.
I remember that day, because I was taking
Right.
babies to. But
You did a lot of work, Mim.
I can remember that.
Right.
It's like it was yesterday.
Well, luckily I was just a kid, so I wasn't there. It was a few years later, and not that many years later, that I came on board, and all the paint was not gone. There was still plenty of work parties 5 years after the station came along. And when we took off the New Haven green, we also took off the original paint that Mr. Richardson had put on there and exposed the wonderful, clean, beautiful oak that is the trademark of the station now. So if you come down to the station and look around, you'll still see a speck of green paint here or there. And if you look in back of some of the seats on the side, you can still see the stain that Mr. Richardson put there that didn't get painted over. It's been a wonderful project, and at the end of the evening, I want to announce something that we're going to be doing with the station that we'll be asking folks to get involved with relatively soon. So let's continue on the journey, and we're going to turn it over to Heidi Ames, who is representing the family of John Ames II. We had invited John III, our former representative, but he was unable to be here tonight, and thank you, Heidi, for standing in for him.
You've just said what I was going to say. I'm very happy to be here representing my older brother. Oops, does this work? yeah, representing my older brother John. Growing up, I never questioned Dad's love and loyalty to the Easton community. Can you hear it? Does this work? Yeah? And it wasn't until I got to thinking about it that I had to remember that Dad was born in 1910, 4 years before World War I, and when it finished, he was 8. The shovel factory was going strong and really kept going all that way until the end of the Second World War in 1945. I was born in 39, so I remember a bit of it. The factory was very much part of his life there. Grandpa was on the board, and there must have been a lot of discussion about what went on. Dad was comfortable here. It was home, and he loved it. My brother Charlton remembers decorating his bike and riding it in the Columbus Day Parade with Dad marching. Dad was president of the Northeastern Savings Bank. He was a fundraiser for the Red Cross, and he had a strong interest in politics. He was on the governor's council when Governor Bradford was in office, and I think that was in the late 40s. Yeah. He was asked to be special assistant to the ambassador of England in 1953, the year that the Queen was coronated. He was well liked there and was asked to continue that job in other embassies, but he wanted to come back to Easton. That was home. I was going to go on to the train station, but you've done such a good job about that, Hazel. So now on to Hazel, who has been maintaining the train station with the rest of the Historical Society for the past 50 years. She was president in 1969, and I think she still is. Are you? No?
It seems that way, though.
Okay.
Thank goodness.
I know she's on the village cemetery board because I have the pleasure of being with her. Hazel Varela is a fund of Easton knowledge. She is also always kind and efficient no matter what crops up in Easton. Easton is lucky to have her, and we have been lucky to have you. And thank you, Hazel, for years and years with us.
Thank you.
One question, did anybody go to the Unionville School with Mrs. Goff as the teacher? You're all younger. Okay.
Your dad was also president of the Lions Club.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, when was that? The War? Lions Club?
I don't know the year he was. I worked with him on the Citizens Scholarship Foundation, and he and I, and several others, Steve Brooks, were the founders of that, and it has evolved into the scholarship program at the Olive Range High School today.
Thank you for mentioning that.
I have to also say something about your father. He arranged for a scholarship that paid for an education at Bridgewater State College. That was my education, so thank you very much for that. And I'm making plans to pay that forward as well, so there'll be a scholarship in my family's name after I'm gone. So thank you. We're moving on to our first vice president of the Historical Society, Mr. David Ames. David spends time in Florida and on a certain island, so he's also our ambassador to foreign parts as well. And he's maintained the connection of his father to the railroad station. So I do remember your dad, who was often at the Historical Society when I was there in those early years. So tell us a little bit about that, David.
Okay. Can you hear me? Am I in the? I got to get up close? Okay. All right. So Hazel asked me to tell you a little bit about Dad, and I'm going to do that. But because my memory is a little shaky on some things, and also because some of what I say is a bit conjectural, I have my sister Nancy and my brothers Bill and Fred here to fill in the gaps. Dad was born at Langwater in 1912. His parents were John Ames Sr. and Nancy Philly Ames. At Dad's birth, as Heidi says, Easton was a much smaller place, not more than about 5,000, and most of the population was clustered in North Easton. The shovel shops at that time were still owned by the family and employed several hundred people. At that time, all of the 7 great stone houses, as Dad used to call them, of the family were Ames family homes, as was also Stone House Hill and Borderlands. The concentration of family in Easton in those days made a lasting impression on Dad. He felt he was the last family member after your dad died who really remembered that time. And I think it was one reason why he felt so strongly about his family and their history. Dad was educated at Milton, Harvard, and Harvard Business School. He was very loyal to all 3, and he was active in fundraising for them all his life. He was an adventurous guy. He climbed the Matterhorn at age 15, and it was just after an appendicitis operation. He went hunting, took long hunting trips in British Columbia, through parts of British Columbia that had never really been adequately mapped. He sailed his boat in the Bermuda race of 1940, except that because of the scare of Nazi submarines around Bermuda, they didn't go to Bermuda. They went to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Before World War II, Dad worked at the shovel company in Parkersburg, West Virginia, right after he graduated from college. And on his last day, he made a shovel himself personally. He was in the location. I went there, Sally and I went there years ago, and it's exactly the way it must have been when he was there. They didn't put a lot of money in improving that facility. And you could see this one little booth, really, and the handles would come in one side and the blades in another. And the person in the booth was responsible for joining the blade and the handle. And Dad had that shovel for many years, and it is now at the Historical Society, if I'm not mistaken. After that, in business school, he worked in electronics and communications between 1937 and 1940. He worked for a company called Codatrol, and Codatrol, I think, was involved in Morse code signaling, and he, I think, received a patent for something that he worked on. Now, guys, can you substantiate? I think he did. This is based on, I had the opportunity to look at a lot of his papers after we moved out of the house at 35 Oliver Street, and I think I saw something about that. Anyway, moving on. Dad was I think, a very patriotic man, and in 1940 he saw that a war was coming. So he joined the Navy, and because of his background in communications and electronics, he was assigned to the Navy code room. And when the first email describing the damages at Pearl Harbor came in, he was in the code room at that time, and he took the messages of the damage to the White House in his little Crosley. Now, does anybody here remember what a Crosley was? Tiny, tiny little car. He drove right up, There was an admiral waiting on the front steps. He gave the information to the admiral, drove off to the offices of the British Admiralty, delivered another message to them, and he said that the admiral said, "Huh, well, we told you so." And he never forgot that. After his time in the code room, he served in the Pacific from 1943 to 1945 on the USS Anthony, which was a destroyer. He saw quite a bit of combat. It was under fire a number of times, but never was, the ship was never hit. This was a very meaningful time to him. He really valued his experiences in the Navy. Let's see here. Dad was married in December 1940. I came along in 1941. Bill in 1943. We were living at 24 Main Street when Dad returned from the Navy. Nancy was born in 1947 when we moved across the street at 25 Main, and Fred in 1952 when we were at 35 Oliver Street. At the end of the war, Dad was, I think he was still an adventurous guy. He was tech-oriented, very loyal, you know. He was committed to his family, his town, schools, and country, responsible with a strong sense of duty. And he faced some big decisions about his life. What career should he choose? Electronics or finance? Easton, how much time does it make sense for him to put into his Easton activities? And then leisure. Was he still going to go on these Bermuda races and big game hunting? Or was he going to have a more family-oriented leisure time? Well, between 1945 and 1948, he dealt with those issues. With a wife and 3 kids by 1948, I think he chose, probably reluctantly, to spend most of his leisure time with his family, and he gave up the big adventures of his youth. He opted for finance over electronics when he chose to work for the Fiduciary Trust Company. And while he made some lifetime friends at Fiduciary, he really didn't like the work. And one day, he was told to go up to New Hampshire and meet with a client. When he got up there, he found that the client, who was an elderly lady, wanted advice on what color her new Buick should be. And after that, he decided this was not the business for him, and he resigned. But fortunately, in 1948, things began to come together for him in Easton. He was named the president of the First National Bank of Easton. He was appointed to the library board, I'm sure with strong urging by Aunt Minnie, who was he was very fond of and who really took an interest in Dad. And then he was elected to the school committee. His involvement in all these quickly deepened. He was elected to the boards of Unity Church, the Village Cemetery, and Frothingham Park. He served on and chaired the Finance Committee and the Citizen Study Committee, and he became a member of, later on, he became a member of the Stonehill Advisory Board and still later a trustee. I'm sorry, thank you. I knew it was important to have you guys here. So the challenges he faced, really a lot of them were related to the steady, strong population growth between 1940 and 1990. They stressed everything Dad was involved in Easton, the bank, the town, and family institutions particularly. With respect to the bank, growing the bank was really vital to providing the services necessary to stay competitive in the expanding market after World War II. Dad was the president of the First National Bank of Easton from 1948 to 1958. The bank grew quite nicely, but it still really wasn't going to be successful on its own. So in 1958, he merged the bank with the First Machinists, and he was chairman of that bank, First Machinists, from 1958 to 1971. And we remember many evenings when Dad would talk about what was going on at the bank, and this issue or that issue, and why did we hire this guy, so on and so on. The First Machinist Bank was further merged into Bay Bank in 1971, and Dad was a director of Bay Bank from 1971 to 78. In respect to the family institutions, in addition to the pressures the population put on them, there are also stresses from aging buildings and systems and fragmented endowments. The library in Frothingham Park were most affected by the rising population of Easton. The library had far more people coming in and using the place than ever had, and Frothingham Park was all of a sudden supporting a school that was, 3 or 4 times bigger than it was when it was originally opened, and it just was overwhelmed by supporting the baseball team, the football team, the track team, the tennis team, the field hockey team, and it was a hard go for the park in the 60s. However, with the cooperation of the town, things worked out rather well. The library is now a joint venture with the town, and Frothingham Park was really benefited when the schools built their own athletic facilities and moved most of the sports to those fields. The aging buildings and systems, that was the particular province of the library and Unity Church. There were lots of headaches, but Dad was very good at resolving structural and mechanical problems. I won't say he enjoyed them, but I think he didn't mind them that much. The fragmented endowments affected all the family institutions and the highway fund as well. What happened was these institutions were created and funded by individual family members. And so the endowments were managed by the original donors or by their descendants. But by the 50s and 60s, Dad could see there was going to come a time when people would not be available to manage those endowments. And he put together all the endowments of these 11 or 12 entities and made the account a very attractive account for professional investment advisors. And this was done in the Easton Community Corporation. Today, the Easton Community Corporation generates about $650,000 to support the library, the church, and the other shareholders. At the town, Dad was on the school committee for 1948, from 1948 to 55, and as we said, the growing town put a lot of pressure on the schools as well as these other entities. And while Dad was chair of the school committee, the center school was planned and the new high school was planned. I don't think that either was completed by 1955.
He had retired.
Yeah,
But,
yeah, I don't think
but
that.
I think we should give credit that obviously he had Peter McConaty as the principal and obviously was there when Bel Moscato was appointed as coach, athletic director.
Dad took a lot of pleasure in Val Moscato's success. Yeah, no, he was very pleased with that. The 1955 to 57 Town Study Committee, probably not many people remember that, but it was important, and they worked very hard. They had 46 meetings in those 2 years. The Capital Budget Planning Committee came out of that, the Industrial Development Commission, and I think a zoning change, which increased the minimum lot size. In 1957, there was a planning to consolidate the town's water supply. There had been individual districts before, and they were not efficient, and the consolidation was an important step forward. And improving the assessing. Apparently, the assessors really didn't have very good maps of the town, and they were assessing, I guess, as best they could. So this committee was responsible for new maps and also a change in governance. The committee recommended the town management style. Dad also was very involved in the finance committee, but I just have I just don't remember what his dates were, and I'm not sure. I can't remember what the issues he had there were, but I suppose they were generally the normal finance committee issues that we're all familiar with. Then I was going to say something about Stonehill, I guess. Or maybe I did say something about Stonehill. I apologize. Yeah, in the case of Stonehill, he worked to help establish Stonehill as a competitive small liberal arts college. His particular contribution was advising the college on investments and finance. He was a member of the Board of Advisors from 1968 to 1988, a trustee from 1981 to 1988, and he was he was given an honorary doctorate of business administration in 1984. Stonehill College was one of the several entities that were really close to him. He enjoyed working with Stonehill a great deal and took a lot of pride and satisfaction in the success that the college had. So I think with all that, you probably get a sense of why Dad was interested, wanted to support the gift of the railroad station. I think he saw it as a Richardson building commissioned by the family, a vehicle for preserving the rich history of Easton, much of it family related, and I'm sure he thought that the Historical Society would be a good thing for the town. Plus, I know that he felt that the people on the Historical Society board were good people and would do a good job with it, which proved to be quite right.
Okay.
Yes, Fred, speak up.
This is a little known fact about our father was that he was president of the Coke Samson Memorial Hall. So I just wanted to all the buildings.
Is that located in Easton, Fred? Well, I want to add something that Bill brought up. Your dad was a member of the Lions Club, and he was a young man when he joined. He was also one of the few Lions Club members who apparently weren't recruited by Mr. Williams over there. But I was privy a few years ago to some of the early newsletters that were sent out by the Lions Club, and they kept track of all the boys that were overseas that were members of the Lions Club, and your dad featured prominently. They followed him wherever he went in the Pacific. So the family connection to the Lions Club is very, very strong as well. we'd like to move on to our next speaker, and that is Minnie Ames, who is representing the family of Oliver Ames.
Thank you. Is this working? That's okay? Okay. I'm Minnie Ames. My dad was Oliver, younger brother to David and John. And like his brothers, I think Easton was very important to my dad. In particular, he was very committed to conserving open space in the town and also preserving historic buildings. But I think for Dad, the train station gift was particularly significant for a couple of reasons. The train station gift really represented a turning point for Dad in terms of his involvement in Easton. In 1969, when the gift was made, as Heidi and David have been describing, his brothers were really very involved in the town of Easton and had been for a very long time. They had raised their families for decades in Easton and had been very strongly committed to a number of Easton organizations. And that really wasn't true for my dad at that point. He was living and working in Boston. He was the representative for a Boston district in the state Senate and had been for many years. My older brother and sister were in schools in Boston. So my dad's life, his family, his community was very much Boston-based at that time. So when he talked about the gift of the train station, I think one reason that it was really significant for my dad was that this was the first time he had worked with his brothers on an Easton community project, and that was really significant for him. And it was also really the last time he would work with his brothers because John passed away a few years later. So that was one reason that this project was very significant for him. The other was that from this point on, he really became very concerned with the preservation of H.H. Richardson buildings in Easton, and particularly the smaller, more at-risk buildings. Of course, by the 1960s, H.H. Richardson was a very famous architect and even had been during his own lifetime. But a number of his smaller buildings had been demolished. And even in the early 60s, there were a number of train stations that were torn down. So I think that this was something that Dad was really aware of, that these historic structures, H.H. Richardson buildings, were being torn down. There really wasn't a lot of public funding or other resources available for preserving buildings like this. So for Dad, that was a significant problem. At the same time, the preservation of small H.H. Richardson buildings was becoming very important for Dad for a completely different reason. And that was that his mom, Nancy, had passed away the year before in 1968. And while he and his brothers were mourning her loss, they were also trying to figure out what to do with their parents' estate, Langwater, which their dad had grown up at, and their grandfather, Frederick, had built in the 1850s. And as the family story goes, my uncles, John and David, had their homes in Easton and certainly weren't interested in taking on another estate. So they pulled my dad aside and, kind of patted him on the back and said, "Oliver, it's either you or the bulldozers." Which really were the only two options for a property like this. Either take it on privately or bulldoze and develop it. And I think that was really persuasive for my dad, not only because here was this home that his family had lived in for over 100 years, but even more significantly, on the property there were two small H.H. Richardson buildings. And so the question was, how do you protect these buildings? There was the Gate Lodge and also the Gardener's Cottage. So the Gate Lodge, even back in the 1960s, was a relatively well-known H.H. Richardson building, even though it's very small. The Gardener's Cottage, I would defer to the Richardson experts in the room. I think it may be the very least significant H.H. Richardson building still standing. But it is still standing, and it's in very much the same condition that it was in 50 years ago, which I think is really to my dad's credit. Before he owned both of these buildings, they were modified, but in the 40 years that they were under his care, he maintained them as is. And I think that was very much because of my dad and my mom's commitment to preserving H.H. Richardson's work. So when Hazel talks about, the shock that she felt, but also the huge responsibility at being handed that key to the train station, I think my dad knew exactly what that felt like because he was going through something very similar at the same time. So, as he's sort of struggling to figure out what to do with these Langwater buildings, the train station comes available. And I think for my dad, finding an organization, and in particular a local organization, that would use the building, that would be committed to preserving the building was incredibly important. And I don't think there was ever really any question that the Historical Society was the right candidate for that. But I think that our dads and cousin brother probably had no idea at the time, 50 years ago, what a great decision they had actually made, or 50 years later, how well used, how well maintained, how well enjoyed the buildings would be. So I think they would be very happy to be here today, celebrating the 50th anniversary, but would also recognize that the real celebration wasn't in handing over that key, but in all of the hard work that has taken place since then by many people in the town of Easton, and in particular the board of the Historical Society. So I think that's the real celebration today.
Before I give these back to Ed, I just want to mention coming attractions. Saturday, we do have a bottle and can drive. It's in memory of Ken Martin, who started the process in 1987. And I think I figured out that he probably was responsible for about $15,000 in bottles and cans during his lifetime. And again, keep in mind that that money really helped utilities and whatever else. Sunday is our annual meeting. We'll be at Queesit. And the speaker is going to be the head librarian. She's an extraordinary individual, Dr. Omaha. And she's going to reminisce about really the library campus during her experiences there. That's 2 o'clock at Queesit. And the last thing is that on the third Sunday of May, I think it's the 19th, we are going to have an autographing session. And you can bring your new book, the 250-page colored book, and Buddy and John will be there to autograph it. I assume it's probably 1 to 4, but you'll get emails on that. And thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to finish up with a couple of stories about your dad. Number one that you didn't mention was that he was the keynote speaker when the veterans dedicated the World War II memorial. And he spent his speech detailing the actions of a lot of his contemporaries and never mentioning what he did, other than to quote, perhaps for the only time ever, a Democrat. And that Democrat was John F. Kennedy. He said, and your father said, "I was no hero, they sank my boat." And that's exactly what happened. He spent hours in the Pacific Ocean, and it was pretty amazing. Now, the other thing is, Hazel and I rarely disagree. I may disagree, but I just say yes, ma'am, and salute. But we disagreed. Hazel, as you may know, does the community calendar every year, and one year she decided to honor your father with a biography. And we disagreed over one thing. She just wouldn't put in the fact that he was the club champion at the country club. I said, Hazel, that's important. It's the country club. And
It's in there.
yes,
Finally.
yes, she put it in, as did the Boston Globe when your dad passed away. It was in his obituary as well. The country club.
I asked what country club. He said,
The-
the country club.
Exactly.
He won the golf championship.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing. Yeah. And the last thing is, we've had this beautiful, beautiful building for 50 years. And there have been many, many changes. I've been working with Frank this summer to sort through the collection, which keeps piling up in our space. And the collection has become almost as valuable as the beautiful building itself. And last year, we received a grant from the Community Preservation Act Committee to study putting in climate control and fire suppression at the station. And the study is nearing completion, and we're going to be starting a fundraising campaign rather than ask the town for more money. And you'll be hearing about that soon, and I hope you will help to continue this wonderful tradition started by the Ames family and support the railroad station. So with that, I'll open the floor for any questions. And does anybody have anything that they would like to add? We have a plethora of Ameses here. There's 4 or 5 more over there. Yes, William.
I remember Dad was, after the war, he was on the civil defense team in Easton, and they had little radios. Dad had a truck, and they had a little walkie-talkie radio, and they had these sudden drills. Like everybody was probably aware. There must have been 10 of them. They all get in their trucks or cars, and so the one that came in, I remember I could hear in the radio said there's an alien spaceship on Bay Road, over Bay Road. So they all got in their trucks and probably drove to the Union Villa. Maybe that was code for the Union, just go to the Villa. But anyway, Dad got a big kick out of that, you know. It was like the old days on the ship, you know. Okay, let's go, boys, let's go.
Anybody else? All right. Thank you all for coming. And once again, thanks to the Williams family and RBC Investments. Thank you.